and hand off to the stars of the evening. And I'm going to let them, I believe, introduce each other. So Annie Liontas and Chloé Cooper Jones, we're really excited that you're here. Excited to hear about your books, about your writing, and about your writing lives. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for bringing us this event. And I'm very excited to be an audience member now, and I will be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zach. I'm just so grateful to the Writers Center and to all of you for joining us tonight on this very dreary, wintry evening. I had a chance to do an event last year with Ginny Hartman, and we were in conversation and just had like a great talk. I think she's here tonight. I love Chloé Cooper Jones, and if you only have to buy one book tonight, please go buy Easy Beauty. It's just brilliant and should be read by everyone, honestly. And I just feel like we're so lucky to have her in the room with us. So I'm just going to do a very brief bio for Chloé, and we'll read a little from the work, and then we'll have a conversation. Chloé Cooper Jones is a professor, journalist, and the author of the memoir Easy Beauty, which was named a best book of 2022 by the New York Times, USA Today, New York Magazine, the LA Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and was a finalist for the 2023 Pulitzer Prize in Memoir. She was also a Pulitzer Prize finalist in feature writing in 2020. She's a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, a Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant recipient, a Howard Foundation Fellow, and an associate professor of writing at Columbia University. She lives in Brooklyn, New York.
Thank you, Annie. And thank you, Zach and the Writers Center. It was really cool to actually listen to that intro and learn more about what you guys are doing. It's what an incredible resource in DC. And if you buy one book tonight, it should not be my book, it should be Annie's book because it's so amazing. I'm really excited to talk about it. I have so much to say, but here it is. I feel like I should be propping it in my, well, I don't know how to do it, but here it is. And I'm going to read a brief bio, and then I'm going to invite Annie to read for a little bit of this great book for us. So Annie is a genderqueer author of the memoir Sex with a Brain Injury on Concussion and Recovery, which was featured on NPR's Fresh Air with Terry Gross and was selected as Self Magazine's Book of the Month. Their debut novel, Let Me Explain You, was selected as a New York Times Editor's Choice. Annie co-hosts a literary podcast, Lit Friends, and live in Philadelphia with their wife, dog, and Email the rabbit. Is that a real rabbit named Email?
Yeah, that's his real name, and he's right behind me. And as a treat at the end, maybe I'll show you Email.
Okay,
He's
definitely.
always on demon time though. He looks really cute, but he's just an agent of chaos.
That we'll definitely need to see Email. That's the most amazing name for a rabbit of all
Thank you.
time. I'm hoping that we'll do an animal swap. Maybe everybody on this Zoom
Yes.
animal will all have to lift them. I have a very cute dog who just had a big surgery yesterday, so she's wearing like an adorable onesie to cover up her stitches.
Aw.
We'll just all look at each other as adorable animals. But without further delay, will you please read some from this incredible book?
Yes, thank you so much. So I will start just by saying this book was a very unexpected, it was just very unexpected. I had 3 head injuries in a year, which really changed the course of my life and my experience to my body and relationship to the world. And started to realize that actually a lot of people have this experience. I mean, a million people a year get a head injury, and then add that to all the people who've been, suffering with mild, moderate, or severe head injuries. But I started to understand or get the sense that there was not a lot out in the world apart from maybe self-help or clinical studies to help me explain what was happening to myself. And Toni Morrison says, if you don't see the book that you want in the world, then you have to write it. And that's kind of what happened here. So I'm just going to read a very brief excerpt from the first chapter, The Life Cycle of a Concussion, and then we'll dive into convo. It starts with a big bang. It comes from the sky, a meteor, a falling object, a box. It comes out of nowhere, a car, a baseball, an opponent's fist, a partner's fist, an officer's baton, a player's helmet, the banned Kani Basami throw during the girls' judo tournament, a skateboard crash, a roller coaster, the blast of an IED, a low-sitting shelf, a low-hanging branch, a rogue wave, a 2x4. Or you fall off your bike on a quiet road. You do not pass out. You aren't likely to. Less than 10% of concussions result in loss of consciousness. This happens only if the rotational forces at the junction of the midbrain and the thalamus result in a disruption of the system that regulates your sleep waking. That is, you get hit at just the right spot. Later, you will wish you had passed out for just a minute or two, as proof to you and everybody else that something happened. You'll secretly wish that there was blood, not too much blood, not like a whole brain bleed, just like a touch of Halloween-style makeup. Your brain, which is the texture of butter, ricochets around in its own liquids. It slams against the wall of the skull. The axons that connect the white matter of the brain, each a tiny filament less than 1/100th a human hair in diameter, fray and tear. The headaches, the dizziness, these will come soon enough. Right now, you're freaked because something is up with your eyes. You were told by the cartoons that you'd see stars, but actually the world is retreating, as if the air is taffy being pulled and stretched. The world in present tense, and you several seconds behind. Your friend answers the phone call you don't remember making, scrapes you off the pavement, stealing glances at you in the passenger seat because he's nervous you'll fall asleep or worse. You try to be the same person you were before you fell off your bike, crack a joke about how hard your head must be. Only you're not sure if you actually spoke out loud, or if you said the joke twice, or if your friend was actually the one who made the joke. This is called, you are told, confusion. At the hospital, if you're lucky, you're put through a CAT scan. The CAT scan does not show a thing. Technology cannot yet detect the microscopic axonal injury of concussion. The scans come back normal. The formal diagnosis is traumatically induced transient disturbance of brain function, but the people who treat you now and in the coming months interchangeably use the word concussion, mild head trauma, and traumatic brain injury, so that when you leave with the paper that says what you have and what you should do, which you cannot read, why can't you read? You were in the Acorn group in 2nd grade, which means you've been praised for your reading ability since age 7 and are pretty sure you've only gotten better since then. You are lost. You realize you have no idea what a concussion is really. You return to work because the pamphlet says you should be good in 2 or 3 days. Here come the headaches, the sensation that your head is full of gauze, distortions in your periphery. You catch the start of people's sentences, but by the time they get to the question you're supposed to answer or the thing you're supposed to remember the next time you see your colleague or boss, you forget what's been said. You still can't read. The words on the page refuse each other like oil and water. So you fake it. When you do finally get reading back, you can't recall what the paragraph is about when you get to the bottom. You can't draw a clock. The numbers get all bunched up, 7 to 12 crammed together like the condiments on a fridge shelf. And that is definitely not where the 6 goes. Even your little nephew knows the 6. You walk outside on your lunch break. The sun brings new hurt. The whooshing cars, screaming birds, the trash truck, snippets of chatter, lawnmower. It's all a grind in your head. You have to cross the street because the guy in front of you is wearing a neon patterned shirt. Your mother calls. You can't listen to her for 2 minutes before nausea sets in. Thank you.
I'm so glad you read that section, because I just feel like there's so much in this early chapter, this first chapter, but even just in the first section that you read that just encapsulates so many of the things that I want to talk about with you and ask you about, which is that this book, I think, is pretty profoundly generous in a sense that I like to think about a lot with literature. And in fact, like one of the things I am trying to think about the most or aim for the most in my own work or in appreciation of other people's work is like an assessment of generosity. And by what I mean by this is just that this book is giving readers so many different levels of things. One is just simply the pure beauty of your prose. I mean, I was completely 100% in that first paragraph, the way that we don't know exactly yet in the very first words, what you're referring to, but this list feels ominous almost immediately, that it could be coming for any of us, right? That any moment something radically can arrive in our lives and shift our understanding of ourselves, of our partners, of our abilities. And I just think the way that you approach that on a sentence level in this first chapter is so incredible. And I have a specific question about that, but just if you let me ramble in awe of you for a moment more. This passage and the book itself is both addressing like very difficult things, very raw and vulnerable things, and is often done with such a great sense of humor. Like the line about like they call this confusion, or like, hey, I'm in the Acorn group, like what, like, I mean, that they call this confusion. I feel like I just put the book down for a little while and was like, damn, that's so good. So I think that just the tonal variety of this book is such a gift, but then you also, throughout the whole book, it's extremely anchored by a personal experience, but you go to so many different places in terms of research or other people's stories, statistics, things from Greek mythology, things from other forms of literature, other writers' works. And it's hard for me to think of an example or too many examples of books that integrate like both the personal and the sort of exploratory like process. We call in one of my Columbia classes, we call this process materials, like the ways in which you can pull process materials from the world, from poems to other people's works to theory. And I just feel like the integration of your process materials in with your narrative is so masterfully done. So I just want to say all that to give, like, for those of you who haven't yet read Annie's book, like a little bit of a over, like a, just a view of like the incredible richness and wealth that awaits you. But now I just want to ask you a couple specific questions about this. One is it on a craft level, in this first paragraph is written in the second person, this you voice. Can you talk about the choice to begin the book in this way? I have some suspicions about why you might have done this, but I felt like it was extremely effective in creating a deep connective sense, but also this sense in which it eliminated a lot of separation very importantly. And I wonder if you could just talk about that choice.
Yeah, well, first, thank you for just such a thoughtful read of the work and really seeing it for what it wants to do, which I think on a certain level is to capture an impossible experience. I mean, Susan Sontag and others talk about like this like that the work on the page, I think maybe both of our books are an act of translation in some way, right? It's to help, and I don't want to overspeak, maybe you don't see your work like that. But this experience, and I'm thinking about what you said about how anything could come for us at any time, right? And really like the human experience is such a vulnerable one, right? Like we're just these like soft-bodied creatures that are hurting at all times, and it can get worse, right? Like it can always get worse, as the Irish like to say, I guess. Um, but I was really cognizant of the fact that unless you've had a head injury, and because our culture has these false narratives about what it means to have a brain injury, right? Even quote unquote a mild one. I felt like there was an imperative to invite the reader into the experience and to help them and to sort of resist some of the narratives from Hollywood and some of the narratives that like special interests, not only the NFL, but pharmaceuticals and spoiler alert, the trains, the insurance companies and trains way back in the 19th century, all of these kind of false ideas and mythologies around head injury. And it felt important to elongate that experience and to put us right into the like, that front seat using the second person point of view, which, like, you know, I think most writers are like always flirting with the second person and also a little wary of, like why do you have to use it? But it felt right. And also there was a kind of natural propulsion once I got it started that felt true. But I tried to use it also sparingly, knowing that it can, you know, over a full book and can get a little exhaustive.
Yeah, the second person it's like a semicolon where it's like so magical, such a great tool, but you have to wield it very gently and carefully. And I think that there's just like a tremendous intentionality as you're speaking to it in the use of the second person. I think with all sort of, well, I think one commonality of what we might call like literature of the body or disability literature is a concern about voyeurism, or about like sort of the sense in which someone could be telling their story as a means of like explaining how different their life is from everybody else's life. And there's truth in that, perhaps, that maybe the experience that you have is different from, and certainly in my book, my life experience is very different from others. But there's actually, I think quite often, like bridging that gap is like always sort of the work to be like, and for disability specifically, it is the one identity that anybody can fall into in an instant. And it's the one that if we are lucky enough and get to live a very long life, we will have a relationship to disability that's actually winning and surviving and getting to like live long enough to watch your body and your mind shift and change. But one thing that I think is important to make a differentiation about, and you do this so well in the book, is that the lived experience of physical, very visible physical disabilities, which I have and wrote about, and invisible disabilities is extremely different, comes with a different set of challenges. So for me, unless I'm on a Zoom conveniently and nobody can see me move, like I'm a very obviously physically disabled person. Absolutely nobody has like ever doubted that as soon as they've seen me. But you have to talk a lot about doubt in this book in a pretty profound and like very wide-ranging way. And also the way that doubt creates all these other things, like the desire to lie or the feeling of being invisible and wanting to remain invisible. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the experience of doubt, and how it operates in this book, and how you conceptualize doubt in such a rich way. Because not, I won't spoil this, but like in your chapter about doubt, the sort of concept of doubt really has an amazing arc in terms of like going from something sort of negative to being about love and understanding. So I just thought that was like, I don't know, it really knocked me out in the best possible way. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of doubt and invisibility.
Yeah, I mean, you know, again, I'm thinking of this like kind of culturally and the frameworks in place where like we have to say like believe women, believe people of color, you know, like there are these like cultural frameworks that each of us is just constantly succumbing to. And I definitely think of this book as like in the body of queer crip literature, you know, and thinking about like just like contributing to the great body of work, but maybe specifically looking at like a chronic condition like this, or like, and it doesn't have to be TBI, right? It could be like fibromyalgia. It could be, you know, you had a miscarriage. It could be all of these experiences that throw us into doubt with our own bodies, doubt with these systems at play. But on a personal level, you know, a lot of this book is it kind of focuses on my marriage specifically, which was, I mean, we talked about divorce. If you heard the Terry Gross interview, she asked me like 3 times, how was it to almost be divorced? And I was like, yeah, it sucked. but you know, it was such a strain on my marriage, the injuries and the invisible nature of the condition, that doubt became this huge looming um weight, not only, you know, in my interpersonal interactions in the world, but in my own home, you know, and in this relationship with my wife of 20 years that like you know, or at that point, I guess 15, that I thought was, you know, we were good. We were like, we're good. And then all of a sudden, I'm dealing with these injuries, and she is too. She has her own relationship to these injuries. And because they're invisible, because we, you know, part of it is just like educational. What does it mean to have a head injury? Part of it was the fact that like you know, I hid for a long time a lot of the nature of my injuries and how sick I was. Um, some good reasons and some really complicated reasons. I really had to investigate, like, what does it mean to have doubt? And, you know, um, how is that actually holding space for the relationship to allow that doubt to live and then to find a new way perhaps to connect together? And one of the later essays in the book, I actually have a conversation with my wife over multiple months, and I basically turned to her one day and I was like, how would you feel if I recorded a Q&A about the worst time in our lives, and then I'll print it out, I'll write a transcript and I'll print it out, and you can take a Sharpie and cross out anything you don't want published. And she was game, and she didn't actually cut a ton, honestly. Um, but it was part of the way of acknowledging that a head injury or something as debilitating as this, or the experience of disability, does not affect a single person. It affects a partnership, it affects a family, and it's not all negative, right? Like it's not like I'm it certainly my experience comes with quite a bit of pain, but it's also been a deeply expansive experience, and something I often think is like, I kind of wouldn't wish it on anyone, but I also wouldn't give it back.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm curious, you know, your question, Chloe, you're kind of talking about like visibility and doubt. And my sense in reading Easy Beauty is that we each have this kind of relationship to hiding and pain, and how we want to or kind of avoid being seen. I wonder if you want to talk about that at all.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, both of our books are circling like a huge question, a pretty universal, I mean, like maybe the most universal thing that lots and lots of books and lots of different genres have tried to take a whack at, which is like, how do we survive this like eternal rupture between how we present ourselves to the visible world, how our exterior informs the way that people respond to us, and the disconnect between that and our interior selves. And I think for me, a lot of what I'm writing about in Easy Beauty is that being a very, I'm very short. That's part of my disability. I'm short, much shorter than the average woman, and I walk in a way that people often read as precarious, even though it's not. It's just sort of the way that I walk side to side. And so I've just lived this life in which like the body that I present to the world looks like weak, fragile, in danger, perilous, and it invites like the sort of a pity response in people. It invites an infantilizing response in people. It emboldens people to sort of remove my agency under the guise of good intentions, and it desexualizes me in certain people's eyes. And so, of course, none of those things are like seem to have a relationship to my interior self, which I think is like full of agency and like ability and capability and complexity and frailty, but not the kind that they think they're seeing. Like, and so it's just this sort of eternal battle to sort of rectify the interior self and the exterior self, which is not an experience that is specific to disability, but rather is like part of the human condition. I think something that's so amazing about reading your book is you're looking at a lot of these things. It's too simplistic to say from like the reverse, because that's not quite true, but it is from like a different facet of the prism or something. And the issues though are at their core about this sort of irreconcilable self. And I'll just say like one tiny example, and I wonder if you have a version of this. I mean, there's several examples I feel like in your book that are pretty crushing in their own way. But one little tiny example that I have is like when my book came out and I was on book tour, I was going to Portland, which I feel like I saw a picture of you in Portland. You were just there.
Yes.
You were at Powell's.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing. So I was going to Portland
Great
and
story.
I was like in the middle of my book tour and my like lots of great things were happening and I'd done a couple events that were sold out and I was feeling like the most powerful I'd ever felt in my life. And I was alone in an airport and I was like, had my headphones on. I think I was like listening to some like happy, upbeat music. I wish I could remember what. And I was walking through this airport. It was one of those moments where I was like, I'm doing it. Like I'm living my dream. Like I wrote a book, it came out, I'm on tour. I'm so happy. I'm wearing an outfit I love. I'm like cruising to get on a flight to just go do more book. I felt so like full of my own like in power, right? Like my own agency. And I was proud of myself. And as I was walking, the security guard started like waving at me and then like ran up to me and I had my headphones on. I took on and he grabbed my arms and he just went, be careful, be careful. Like, who's with you? Do you have someone with you? Like, where's your helper? Like, where? And it was just this just very sort of brutal switch of like, ah, that's right. The thing inside of me is not visible to people. This like radically other thing is what's visible. And that's how at least their first step toward me and their interaction with me is going to be informed by that rather than what I feel is like the truth of a self. Not to say that these things aren't in a relationship, the body and the mind, of course, are, but I think like that's not in my book reading. That just happened fairly recently. And I think about that moment as like such a crystallized example of this fissure. And I feel that same thing all the way through your book. So do you have like a specific sort of like maybe your first entry into that moment after your first concussion or a few concussions? I can think of so many you do this throughout the book, but I want to let you say if there's like one moment that really this sort of theme came home the hardest for you.
Yeah, I wouldn't say our experiences are inverse, but maybe in this one kind of narrow focus, it seems like there are some examples where that's true. You know, for me, like I look pretty able-bodied and I'm also really short. I think we're about the same height, if I recall from when we met. But you know, as a queer presenting, you know, gender queer person, I think you know, I look pretty strong. I am actually pretty strong. I'm like an athletic person and I, you know, like did a lot of work to build some of that back, but especially in the early years and even now, I I have these triggers that are really hard to navigate in the world, like overhead lighting, fluorescent lighting, loud noises, hunger. I mean, I was essentially for many years and still on a bad day, like kind of a toddler who could handle like no stimuli. And you know, one example is I remember, I mean, we were just talking before the Zoom event started how we both have really long commutes. I commute to DC from Philadelphia, and that was pretty grueling in the beginning. And I want to say that loud because I think that we don't reckon, you know, in this capitalist society with how hard it is for people who are dealing with unwellness or disability to just like hold down the job. And then you add a commute or you add stress. And on this particular day, I didn't have enough water. I was rushing for a train, and my brain essentially got flooded. You know, it's like an expression that, or like a actual nomenclature that we use, just got flooded with stimuli, and I was really disoriented and was thinking like, okay, my train is down here, and then was like, no, that's not where my train is, and I booked it all the way back to the other side of the station, and it was like, actually, no, the train is where you thought it was, near the McDonald's in the first place. And just this like, you know, constant like internal lived chaos that of course for me that night resulted in like a terrible migraine. And let me tell you, migraines are terrible, but a 3-hour train ride with a migraine is just like, the amount of times I did that in my first year on this commute was just like so overwhelming. And of course, like people who are female presenting, like having a migraine is, I mean, there are jokes about that, right? So like the ways we're not believed or received, I would just like, I would have to protect myself without any recognition from the external world. Although I will say one time that happened in this very lovely Amtrak, I love an Amtrak conductor with my whole heart, and he just like dimmed the lights for me and was like,
Oh,
he could tell it was still too, he just like turned them all the way off. And, you know, that was like this wonderful, rare kindness where, you know, he heard me and I appreciated it. Um, but I also find that when people think of me as being vulnerable, much like you were saying about your own experience, Chloe, they misapprehend the ways that I'm vulnerable and kind of project onto me what that looks like when it could actually be something entirely different. And it's not malicious, it's just a little misinformed, you know. And so um I'm aware of the fact that I'm just like one of millions of people with like a multiplicity of this kind of experience, and that mine is not theirs, and that they might have other vulnerabilities or other, you know, other weaknesses, and just understanding that this is like one of an example of many ways of dealing with this kind of injury.
yeah. I have some more questions, but I thought I should say to everyone who's here, we are going to have a little Q&A. And so if you have a question for Annie, you can just drop it in the chat at any time. And we really welcome those questions, so you can think on it a little bit. And then we'll take some questions from the audience in a little while, maybe like a few minutes. But yeah, I mean, on the same subject, I wrote in my little notes here this line that really struck me, and I think it's like deeply related to everything that you're saying. It's on page 38, and I'm sort of paraphrasing in my notes, but it's a line about treating pain as if it needs to be masked, and that is definitely a deeply resonant thing for me as someone with a pain disorder, and definitely the ways that, well, I would imagine it's probably resonant for multiple people on this chat, perhaps. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see the sort of connection between pain and shame and pain and hiding, and talk about a little bit of like your arc of processing this to some extent, so that that hiding or that shame wasn't going to take over your life and very possibly sort of ruin a lot of the sort of greatest connections in your life.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of this is about inheritances, right? Like I'm a Greek immigrant and first generation of college, and the idea of like self-reliance and resilience was something baked into me like from a very early age. And then some like familial dysfunction really cemented that. And I'm thinking about, you know, even just like those cultural inheritances. And I have this little survey online that I could drop into chat if people want, but it's a little bit of like a teaser for what the book talks about in terms of its like historical research. And there's quite a bit of historical research about like, you know, for instance, they thought Yale University put out a study in 2019 that suggests that Henry VIII actually had a history of head injuries, and that a lot of his rage, which resulted in like thousands of people being killed, was a direct result of a history of head injuries, very serious ones, and they think actually he had CTE, which is what football athletes have, um, upon what's the word I'm thinking of? Post-mortem
Yeah.
analysis.
From like jousting?
Yes, he had like multiple jousting accidents,
Oh.
including one where like he thought he had the visor down and it wasn't down. And then another one where his horse fell on top of him. And so of course these just like uh, if you get one head injury, you're 2 times likely to get another. If you have a second, you're 2 to 3 times likely to get a third, it starts to build exponentially. And these were like pretty serious with, of course, even less interventions than we have now. But I mean, I remember learning, most of us think that like pharmaceuticals create the narratives around injury and illness, and it's true. And in this case, of course, the NFL. But I remember learning as part of my research for this book that it was at the advent of the train, and which I should say, like, I want to say it was like between 1860 and 65. I'm probably messing that up. Train accidents went up, they spiked like 500%. And it's because there was like no standard gauges on trains. They would like go in any direction. There was no timetables, and there were just accidents all the time. And it was the first time that we were moving at this speed. Like human bodies had never even moved at this speed. And they called it railway shaking. And Charles Dickens actually suffered from it. And I learned in my reading that his train went over a ravine, except his car like dangled on the edge and he survived. But he documents in his letters where he was basically like, yeah, I'm not right in the head. And we understand that now to be TBI and also PTSD, which the word does not correlate, but they are kind of comorbidities. Um, and so when we have this kind of history that informs like our legal system, our medical practice, how can it not inform our interpersonal relationships and then our own relationship to pain and shame, right? So it's the reality is like this is quite historical and institutional and societal. But most of us are sitting at home feeling like completely crazy and isolated in that experience, in that suffocation of pain and shame.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, this is all just speaking to what I was saying at the very beginning of this, how generous this book is, because I did find, yeah, there was so much that I learned that I didn't know. The Henry VIII thing really, I found that to be so
Wild.
fascinating and wild. And I also was like, that makes sense. Like jousting, yeah, you're gonna get some head injuries from that. But then also sort of embarrassingly, I kept finding myself putting the book down to Google various celebrity head injuries that are mentioned. So it's like, early in the book, she's referencing George Clooney, and I was like, so my search bar now is things like Lady Gaga head injury, George Clooney head injury. And I mean, I'm really behind. I didn't know any of these things, but George Clooney, I read some whole thing about George Clooney's horrible head injury and how he lost so much of his memory and lived with so much pain. I kind of wish he would talk about that more or be more, I mean, he can do what he wants, bless his heart. But
Yeah.
but it's
Yeah,
so,
I remember he
yeah,
became, I think, suicidal. And
yeah,
I remember reading about Lady Gaga, and she, I actually feel badly about the pressure celebrities are under, because I think, she was like, oh, I'm fine, I'm fine. But now, like years later, she's doing migraine commercials, like migraine medication commercials. And you're like, is this possibly related to this like unspoken about condition? And yeah, but the amount of just people, celebrities. And I even just found out like George Michael had one when he was 8, and I'm like obsessed with George Michael. So
yeah,
yeah, they just like constantly surprising.
yeah. Well, we have a question in the chat. Maybe my last question to you before I turn it over to everybody else. So if anybody else wants to jump their questions in there, that'd be great. But I think this is just maybe, my guess is that there's many writers in the Zoom with us, and maybe some nonfiction writers or memoir writers. And this is a question that I think is so relevant to anybody who's approaching any sort of personal project. And I feel like you did this so unbelievably well, which is write about people in our lives that we love, in their entirety, which means sometimes not always in the most flattering light. And I think that the honesty with which you specifically render your wife and your relationship, is so, it's just so incredibly well done in this book. I mean, S is certainly given a lot of space to be like extraordinary, but also a lot of space to be like having a really, really hard time with this with you, and doubting you, and having moments where they're not sure what to believe, or like, I found one of the sort of most complicated moments in the book is you being hit in the head by like essentially like a slight piece of bark, and then that rendering like hours sort of immobility for hours. And both she and your doctor, or S and your doctor, both sort of go like, this might be you, this might be a you problem, this might be anxiety, and I just thought, God, so there's so much wrapped up in that. And I know you referenced like this conversation that she was willing to have with you, or that they were willing to have with you. But I'm wondering how you approach this in general, this very sort of delicate but necessary thing of writing about others, in their wholeness, in their most incredible moments, and in moments that are painful to look at, and what kinds of conversations you did or didn't have, and at what stage, and just how you approach the sort of murkiness of that work that we absolutely have to do as nonfiction writers.
I mean, I'm thinking in Easy Beauty how you write about Wolfgang, which of course like is completely different because he's like your child, and like quite a surprise, I think, for you, but also creates this maybe expansiveness, or this I've sensed reading in your work, like just this expansiveness of self that was unexpected, and um maybe forced you to do that kind of reckoning with yourself internally. It is different, I guess, when you're doing that work interpersonally, especially with something like as uh essential as a marital relationship. I mean, the first thing is like I'm very lucky my wife loves me very much, and understands like this is a story I have to tell. And she was my first reader. I gave her early drafts, and I think if she had vetoed something, I would have honored that. I don't necessarily veto, or I wouldn't necessarily honor anybody's veto in my life that I was writing about, but um, certainly my marriage is worth that. Uh, but it felt really germane to the project to say like, okay, if this is about making the unseen visible, that is as critical in this relationship, to do that in this relationship as any other facet of my life, because how many couples are dealing with this kind of thing and are at a loss and don't know how to navigate this and have no models, and it's getting better, but the rates of like marriages that were failing because of TBI, it was like 1 in 2. It was just,
Yeah.
and because we just don't have the tools. I mean, and that could be skewed, who knows, but and it just felt, I think maybe I've forgotten your question, Chloe, so you have to forgive me, this happens sometimes. But it felt like an imperative to see this person wholly imperfectly as an act of love, and as an act of honest writing.
No, you answered my question precisely, and I think that everything you're saying is so crucial. And I love so much what you're saying, that to write somebody in their entirety is an act of love, an act of loving them. So okay, we have some questions for you. Annie, how long after your brain injuries did you make the decision to write about them?
Again, I mean, the whole endeavor was a real surprise. Um, I got the first concussion in 2016, and then the next two within that 12-13 month period. And a couple of years later in 2019, the title essay just kind of came pouring out of me. And it was almost kind of whole, what you see here. I didn't mess too much with a little bit, but not too much. Which never happens. Like that does not happen in my life as a writer. I'm always like reworking material. And I thought like, okay, I did that, that's enough. And then I realized that there was just like, there was a lot more to say in terms of the relationship, between myself and my wife, and also TBI and addiction, TBI and the gender divide, TBI and the and carceral justice, and the fact that like someone in prison is 7 times more likely to have a head injury before they get to prison. Somebody who is housing insecure is 1 in 2 people likely to have had a head injury before they lost their home. And all of a sudden, at just like the minute I started scratching the surface and doing some of this research, it just became evident that there are all of these invisible, unexplored socio-political implications around head injury. And I just was like, okay, you got to keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, that was another, yeah, those statistics were really shocking, but not, again, not surprising. I was so grateful to learn so much through this book. So another question is, Annie, I'm wondering how you relate to neurodivergence as a concept, thinking that sensory sensitivities, flooding responses, and the invisibility of neurodivergence presents similar challenges. Do you feel like your brain injury falls under that umbrella, or is the distinction between a physical injury and other kinds of brain differences important to you? What a great, rich, very nuanced question. Lots
Yeah,
to unpack there.
it's a great question. These are all really wonderful, and I really appreciate them. It's something that I'm continuing to evolve my thinking about, partly as I just like talk with people in the TBI disability community, and give myself permission to understand how I've changed. You know, I I was talking with the writer Kendra Winchester, who does write Appalachia, and she sort of pressed me to think about like my relationship to my own disability and whether or not I use that language and how I conceive of it, and and how I conceive of myself as neurodivergent. And I think I'm uh I still don't have quite the right nomenclature or labels for myself, because it's a changing condition, one that I think like I have periods of disability, or like this temporal disability, and then a couple days where I'm okay. So it's kind of like true of many chronic conditions. Um, and then um have lost my train of thought. But I guess I've created enough of these necessary tools. For instance, as we're talking, I like write words down in this post-it because I will lose my train of thought if I don't have an anchor. I have to have um an accommodation for the classroom I teach in because I can't handle overhead lighting, those kinds of things. And so I think now what I'm grateful for is the idea of neurodivergence and disability being like far broader than we think of it culturally, and that I thought of it even a couple of years ago. And I love even what you're saying, Chloe, about like if we're all lucky, we will experience disability and live that long to have that changed relationship with our bodies and our minds.
Yeah, I mean, I feel very strongly that disability should be disability, neurodivergence, any of these sort of terms that we use on this like larger umbrella. Like I feel like we should all be talking about them all the time. They should be of like extreme relevance and interest to everyone, instead of being sort of thought of as like a marginalized identity, because it is just the fact of having a body and a mind that, yeah, if you're lucky enough and you get to keep living, you'll experience all kinds of changes, whether that comes in the form of illness, injury, in my case, a congenital disability that changes regularly. And as I age, you know, year by year, I'm having a different experience of disability. Like we're all in a relational spectrum to disability, and it's just something that's been so difficult that it's hard. It's just so hard for that to reach sort of cultural consciousness in a way that could just be like help us make friends with the feeling of our body changing rather than it being anyway. This is not the time for my rant about such things.
No, that's why I
Not-
loved Easy Beauty. It feels like being in friendship with, you know, the lived experience in this way.
Yeah, I think that was very important to me, that it was like, and I think something that's really beautiful and important about your book, and it's something you touched on earlier in this conversation, that yes, there are certain difficulties associated with your experiences, but you wouldn't trade them. There's also all these beautiful things. And I think one thing that I identify very intensely with and saw all the way through this book is disability or illness or injury. All these things teach us resilience and adaptability. And I don't mean that like in a trite, like we will overcome way. I mean that in like just a literal, like I've become so much smarter because of my need to problem solve constantly in a world that's not built for me. And like everyone should want to hire me because like I'm gonna problem solve better than most people. I'm gonna like show up harder for most people just simply because I live in a world in which almost everything is an obstacle or a barrier, and I have to thrive in that situation. And just listening to you talking about having your post-it notes and writing down the words and the, you know, the ways that you find anchors in situations that others might take for granted is just such a like an incredible example of like the rich gifts that challenge gives us. And I mean, that sounds sort of trite, but I mean it like quite concretely. Okay, so we have there were so many good questions I want to get to. Okay, so oh, that's really nice. Somebody wrote to us that they think that we have a magical ability with our prose. So nice. Combining lyricism and directness and legibility so beautifully. I'd love to hear about any part of your process that you may use when crafting here's my cute dog. When crafting sentences and paragraphs. Yeah, I'd love to hear you talk about craft, and maybe also specifically you, as I mentioned, like you bring in all this other theory and you do it in a way that's so seamlessly integrated. Did that take a lot of drafts to do that? Did you have some techniques in mind for that? And how do you think about, your sentence writing process?
Well, I was just thinking about when I heard you speak at the Philly Library, that section that you were talking about in like beats of 8, I want to say it was, because it was like the pattern that you had, right? Like I think I'm remembering that correctly,
Yeah,
and
that's right.
how like that rhythm got captured through the language. You know, I am a lyrical writer. I was when I started to realize I had to integrate research, I was like, I was never good at like library studies. I don't know how to do this. And I had to kind of teach myself a little bit from a journalistic perspective, and just like and maybe that's why in some ways it worked, because I was mostly wanting the story and the experience to foreground, and the research to support that. You know, so I'll just give maybe a small example. When I do write about the Henry VIII bit, I started writing, it was so clunky. I was like, this feels like a Wikipedia entry. How do I change that? And I thought of him as like not Henry VIII, just like Henry. I just called him Henry. And I wrote about him, you know, like this like young, at the time before he became the one that is like fixed in our image, he was kind of like this young, sexy redhead who was like athletic, and like people were looked up to him. And, you know, so I just was like, okay, this is just this guy, Henry. And only when he kind of gives in to those rageful, murderous impulses does he become in the work Henry VIII. And that just like allowed me to understand him as a person, you know, and to let the language speak to that, as opposed to just like this historical anecdote.
Yeah, that's so good. Okay, maybe one last question because we're almost at time here. And we were promised a glimpse at email,
Yes.
the rabbit, so we're gonna need that. But maybe just quickly, one person asked about getting over the fear of exposing yourself in a publication, especially if you tried to hide your disability. I think you are incredibly incisive into your own character and your own ability to make like profoundly self-aware observations. That is difficult to do. So yeah, how do you approach that and exposing yourself and writing into vulnerabilities or writing into places that you'd spent your life hiding?
Yeah.
Spent a period of time, at least in your life, hiding. Yeah.
Yeah. Isn't it sort of funny the universe gives you exactly the thing that you need? Sometimes I remember I sort of feel like, by the time you're like 35, 37, all those tools that you've used to protect yourself or, whatever those are about like, it could be procrastination or, in my case, just like such extreme self-reliance that you become like an island to yourself. And of course, like that's not how human beings can live. Um, we're like social creatures that have to eventually depend on one another. And so for me, it became like, essential to the book and probably my own recovery to like become vulnerable, essentially, and to share a lot of that with the reader and on the page. And I guess because I'm Greek and I don't do anything like halfway, I just was like, okay, we're going in. Uh, and there's really like no other way for me to tell the story ultimately.
Yeah. Okay, let's see email.
All right, give me 2 seconds. Let me dig him out real
Okay,
quick.
here's my dog Dolly. She was just spayed, so she's very tender and she's very clingy right now. So she's been really enjoying this conversation. Oh, amazing. Anybody else have their animals? We love to see all your animals. I just want to say that, yeah, I'm your forever fan. I admire this book so much. I'm so grateful that we got to meet in Philadelphia when I was there. And I hope everybody buys this book and buys copies for everyone they know. And I also just want to thank the Writer's Center, but all of you who spent a little time with us this evening. And yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And Chloe, you're like the best conversation partner. And this just was like so joyful for me. And I'm so deeply appreciative. So thank you. Bye,
I feel
easy
like this
beauty.
time went
Really.
so fast. I
I
need
know.
I need a part two. I have this whole list of questions I didn't even get to ask you, but uh, anyway, this has just been so fun, and we'll leave it to Zach to say goodnight or something.
First of all, we'll absolutely do the sequel. So when you're ready for the sequel, just let us know and we'll come back. I think I speak for everyone here that we would gladly log in again to hear the rest of the questions, the rest of the conversation. But everyone, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Please join us again. We have another virtual craft chat tomorrow night. So if you want to come check that out, please do. But we have lots more programming coming up over the coming months and years and eons. And bunnies. I tried to find my cat real quick, but they were one of my cats. They were all looked too comfortable to disturb to pick up, so I let them rest. But thank you all. Enjoy your evenings, enjoy your pets, and we'll see you again soon.